And we're back in the book of Daniel today, Daniel chapter 5. I'm not going to read very much of this. We've studied for the past 2 weeks over this chapter, seen some of the historical happenings as Babylon comes to an end as an empire. And so what we're going to do is just read the last couple of verses, but you remember that Belshazzar, who was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, left in charge at Babylon, the city itself, while his father, Nabonidus, had moved his capital elsewhere because he was very much disliked by the people of Babylon. And so Belshazzar is having his wild party in his royal hall, and he calls for the vessels that had been captured from the temple in Jerusalem to come out so that he could drink wine out of them with all of his partygoers and praise his gods and talk about how they had triumphed over the Almighty God of Israel. And so that's kind of the setting. The hand appears and writes on the wall and etches some words into it that Belshazzar couldn't understand. He calls his wise men, they couldn't understand it either, and ultimately the queen, probably Nebuchadnezzar's widow, comes and she says, hey, I remember that there's a man that can actually understand these types of things, and he did that during the reign of your father Nebuchadnezzar, who frequently called on him to come and interpret things for him. And Daniel was called in. He was remembered at that point in time, and he was able to interpret. Basically, the writing that God had written on the wall, it essentially said, your kingdom has been numbered, it's been weighed by God, it's been found wanting, and it's over. The Medes and the Persians are coming in to conquer your kingdom. And Belshazzar, secure in his royal city and thinking that his city was invincible, said, great job, Daniel. I appreciate the interpretation of this. You can be the ruler next to me in the kingdom, and here's all this treasure. And then he continued with his drunken party that night, and in a drunken stupor, the Persian army, the Medo-Persian army came in. Babylonians were in a drunken stupor and conquered the city, and the empire fell. So that was what we saw in the chapter last week, and we see at the very end, the last couple of verses in Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5, verses 29 through 31. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, and put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. And Darius the Mede took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Well, one of the things for me that makes the Bible come alive and become so much more applicable to our lives is seeing how it fits into the historical context. And while nothing can certainly take the place of the Scriptures, and I don't just want this to be a history lesson today, we'll make sure and bring some Scriptures in so that we can see how it nests together. Over and over, history confirms that God's Word is dependable, that it's truthful, that it's accurate. And even as we mentioned here a couple of weeks ago, as we talked about Belshazzar and some of the doubts of the historicity of this account, because there were no records of a Belshazzar in the Chaldean kings. Well, it was found out just not too long ago, a few hundred years back, that he was in fact a ruler, the last ruler in Babylon under his father Nabonidus. And so the records, the historical, archaeological evidence confirms God's word was right all along, even though people want to try to cast doubt on it. So looking at the history, well, it's very rewarding for me. I enjoy it, and it takes what we sometimes impose on the Bible as just being kind of old, unapplicable thoughts and truths, to making them very relevant and real in our lives as we see how God worked in the course of history to accomplish his purposes and his will. And so the theme of the book of Daniel, all the way up to this point, all the way through, is God's rule over the nations. God himself is in control, despite what rulers may think, and we've seen how God's humbled Nebuchadnezzar. Now he's proved himself to the Babylonians, and he's going to continue to do that. Well, let's talk a little bit about the fall of Babylon. All right, and that's our intent this morning, is to discuss a little bit about that. I've mentioned and want to bring back to your attention maybe the broader stroke picture of Babylon in biblical history. From the very beginning of time almost, Babylon has been an important city, an important nation. The early history of Babylon is shrouded very much in strange religious overtones. In fact, throughout the Bible, all the way up almost to the end of the book of Revelation, Babylon became the flagship representative of false religion. And it's going to be identified throughout the book of Revelation and in other biblical writings as the final culmination of false religion that will march against Christ and try to shirk off, throw off his ultimate rule when he returns to the earth in events yet future for all of us. Very first time it's mentioned in the Bible is in Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 through 10. That scripture names a man by the name of Nimrod, the grandson of Ham, as the founder of that city in its dim prehistoric past. All right. Now, by the way, Nimrod is not a good name to have. That's not something that you would want to be called in any sense of the word. He was an evil man. It talks about how he was a man who he hunted for men. He hunted for men's souls. He was intentional and proactive in trying to destroy people's souls and turning them away from God. And so he's the founder of that city, of that location. And the name Babylon itself was derived just the following chapter, in Genesis chapter 11, where the inhabitants of the land of Shinar, that's the southern portion of Mesopotamia, they're recorded as building a tower, and their intent was to build this tower that would reach unto heaven. God had already depicted clearly in the early chapters of Genesis the way that he intended to be approached. And even Adam and Eve's children learned that the hard way in trying to present their own sacrifices, their own offerings to God, instead of the way that God intended. And so they're trying to do that. Well, God says, well, that's not going to happen. I'm in control here, and you're not going to revolt against my rule amongst men. And so he confounded their languages and scattered them across the world. They were unable to communicate with each other to continue their construction of that tower and of that city. And so the work was left unfinished. It's kind of hard to work together as a team if you can't communicate in some way, isn't it? And they couldn't talk. They couldn't communicate. They had different languages. And so they called the name of that city Babel as a result. And that was the foundation also of Babylon. So you have the initial founder and the location spoken of in Genesis chapters 10 and 11. And so the whole concept of Babylon was one of, it was a center of religious significance from those very early days. It was a source of false religion and rebellion against the Lord. That's about all that I'm going to say about the early origins of it. I've already mentioned in the book of Revelation there seems to be a resurrection or a renewal of that empire that's going to take place. And whether it's actually called Babylon in those days, I don't know. It's future events for us, and I can't predict that. But it's called Babylon in the Bible. And again, it's representative of the false religion that will be brought together and unified under the Antichrist as he tries to lead the way in rebellion against God. Now, the city of Babylon doesn't rise to prominence as we've read about it in the book of Daniel until about 1830 BC. All right? But the area in which it's located, it's called Babylonia, has a long history. Right? Early civilization, in fact, some of the oldest civilizations that we know of date back to that particular area around the 4th millennium BC. Successive civilizations have been traced all the way back to about 2800 BC in the area called Ur of the Chaldees. All right, the Chaldeans originated there. There was another prominent individual that we know of in the Bible that was from that region. That was Abraham. And so that's where he started out at. And you can read about that in Genesis as well. And so this is actual history. You can easily look up and see the early beginnings of civilization and how they had their roots in that area. Well, there were multiple hands that were involved in conquering that area through successive generations. And you have people like the Elamites and the Amorites that come in and that are rulers over that land, over the area of early Babylonia. All right. Now, there are some important figures, even in history today, that you may have learned about or heard of in school. The man by the name of Hammurabi, who had a code that was discovered in the early 1900s, some of the earliest codified laws. He was from the area of Old Babylonia, around 1700 BC. And so I don't have to go into a lot of the different individuals that reigned there, but Babylonia developed, and it was an area of contention and hostility between different empires and nations of the world. You see some of them mentioned in the Old Testament throughout the different prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel as well. But you have guys such as Sennacherib, who was one of the Assyrian emperors he's talked about in the Old Testament, who came in and was able to destroy the city of Babylon and burned it down at some point in time. You have these two empires, the Assyrians that were a little bit earlier and the Babylonians that were coming to power as the Assyrians started to wane in their power, but Assyria was able to come in and put a real hurt on Babylon on a number of different occasions. Ultimately, the new Babylonian Empire that really rose to supremacy was founded or rejuvenated under Nebuchadnezzar's father, a man by the name of Nabopolassar. He was brought Babylon to much of its glory, and then Nebuchadnezzar was able to build upon that and bring Babylon to the level that we see it at in the book of Daniel, as they started to conquer massive parts of the known world in those days. Around that period of time, either right at the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's reign or shortly before that, with the help of the Median Empire, the Medes, that was on the rise as well, Nineveh was finally conquered. That was the capital of Assyria. And then, not too long after that, Pharaoh Necho was defeated around the early 600s BC. And so you have some of the ancient world empires that started to go out, such as Egypt and Assyria and Babylon, that's rising to supreme power. But there's another power that was also growing alongside of them to the north and to the further to the east of where they were at. That's the Median Empire, the Medes. And so with the going out of these two other old historical empires, Egypt and Assyria, there was a massive power vacuum that Babylon quickly stepped in and filled. And you see Babylon rise to the brilliant reign of Nebuchadnezzar. That included the early conquering of Jerusalem in 606 BC. And of course the captivity of its inhabitants and the destruction of the city itself. And we've talked a lot about that throughout the course of this study, especially in the introduction. Well, we have a lot of different prophecies that surround the empire of Babylon, especially throughout the major prophets. I want to show you a couple of them, and our point today is really to talk more about the destruction of Babylon. We talked a little bit now about its rise to prominence. We've talked a lot about the glory days of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, and that started to fade away quickly with his passing and handing that empire off to his son and grandson. But all throughout Isaiah, throughout Jeremiah, throughout the book of Daniel, throughout Ezekiel, those major prophets, there's a significant amount of time that's devoted to talking about Babylon. Both its rise to power, the way that God took and used them as instruments in his hand of judgment against Israel, who had turned to false gods, and the prediction of a captivity that was going to last for 70 years. It's seen all throughout those major prophets. And then finally and ultimately, predictions about the destruction of Babylon, not just future in the spiritual sense in the end times, but in those days, during the days of Daniel, that this would actually come to pass in that geographical location. And so, from the time really of Genesis chapter 11 that I mentioned, where Babel is spoken of, up to the book of Isaiah, there's no mention of this area. There's no mention of its rise to power, but Isaiah begins to prophesy that and talk about all of this. Most of the prophecies about Babylon relate to the captivity of Israel, understandably. There are Jewish writers and prophets that are writing and predicting these things, and were very much pushing the Israelite people to understand the gravity of their situation if they didn't turn away from idols and back to the Lord. So that's what most of the prophecy is, but there's still a remarkable amount of prophecy that we can see about the destruction of Babylon as well. So we're going to try to skip through. I'm just going to show you a couple very quickly in Isaiah. And we're going to go to Isaiah chapter 13. And again, just a few short verses. We could read chapters and chapters on this, and that's not my intent this morning. But I want you to get a sampling of what the prophets even predicted before Israel went into captivity. Isaiah chapter 13. How did they know these things? Because the Lord himself inspired these thoughts and helped them to understand it. But Isaiah chapter 13 and verse 17, behold, I will stir up the Medes against them. And if you look in the prior verses, you'll see that it's talking about Babylon. So I'll stir up the Medes against them, which shall not regard silver, and as for gold, they shall not delight in it. In other words, they weren't just looking for loot, they weren't just looking for treasure, they weren't just looking for tributes from subservient nations. They were bent on destruction, bent on cruelty. Their bows also shall dash the young men to pieces, and they shall have no pity on the fruit of the womb. Their eyes shall not spare children. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' excellency, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It shall never be inhabited, neither shall it be dwelt in from generation to generation. Neither shall the Arabian pitch tents there, neither shall the shepherd make their fold there. But the wild beasts of the desert shall lie there, and their houses shall be full of doleful creatures, and owls shall dwell therein. Satyrs shall dance there, and the wild beasts of the island shall cry in their desolate houses, and dragons in their pleasant palaces. And her time is near to come, and her days shall not be prolonged. And so you can see the absolute decimation of Babylon that's predicted here at the hands of the Medes and the Persians. He talks about it further later on. We'll go to Isaiah chapter 47 and just see a couple of verses there in the later prophecies of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 47, really the whole chapter talks about the destruction of Babylon. But in verse 1, come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground. There is no throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for thou shalt be no more called tender and delicate. He talks in verse 2 about some veiled references to uncover the thigh, pass over the rivers, and we'll talk about what that means here in just a little bit. And he's really talking about God's judgment that's going to come on the Babylonians, because God's intent was to use them as instruments to judge Israel, and yet they took it way too far. They were unimaginably cruel and destructive and hateful in the way that they treated God's people. And so God says, we're going to destroy you. All the way down in verse 12, it's interesting as he talks about the judgment that's going to come and Babylon's attempted response. God, almost mocking them, says, "Stand now with thine enchantments and with the multitude of thy sorceries, wherein thou hast labored from thy youth. If so be, thou shalt be able to profit. If so be, thou mayest prevail." Right? You think you can beat this thing? "Thou art wearied in the multitude of thy counsels. Let now the astrologers, the stargazers, the monthly prognosticators stand up and save thee from these things that shall come upon thee." Right? All the astrology and the wise men and their silly attempts at magic and all those things we've talked about all through the book of Daniel. Well, this is kind of rhetorical because there's no saving the empire. God says you're doomed. You're going to be destroyed. So these are predictions of Isaiah. We could see a lot more, but I don't really want to dwell on that for so long. Jeremiah does the same thing, and I'm not going to take the time to go there, but Jeremiah chapter 50 and Jeremiah chapter 51, there are two very lengthy narratives detailing very specifically the judgment and destruction of Babylon at the hands of the Medes and the Persians. And if the prophecies of Isaiah are remarkable because it was predicted long before, 100 years before the captivity of Judah actually occurred and took place, prophecies of Jeremiah are notable because they were delivered at the peak of Babylon's power. At the time when they were at the height of their power. You're going to be annihilated. You're going to be destroyed. It would have been almost laughable for the Babylonians to think that this kind of judgment would fall on them, that their empire would be ended. But Babylon is clearly pictured as being punished because of its epically cruel treatment of the nation of Israel. They were supposed to be God's servants in bringing the appropriate level of judgment to Israel. Well, almost all of the predictions of Jeremiah seem to relate to the fall of Babylon by the attack of the Medes and the Persians. All right? And so we can move on from that thought. The prophecies of Ezekiel are very significant when it comes to the Babylonian captivity. And Ezekiel predicts a lot of the different happenings of the day, the fall of Egypt that would take place shortly after his writing, the destruction of Tyre and Sidon, and then, of course, Babylon itself. And so I only mention these because it's significant to note that these major prophecies throughout the Bible are largely occupied with thoughts about Babylon, the fall of Babylon, the use of Babylon as an instrument of God's judgment. Babylon was extremely significant. We're not talking about just an obscure little no-name location in history in some small, isolated geographical location. This was a world empire that, unlike something the world had ever known, it was fantastic and amazing. We have the prophecies of Daniel. I don't have to go back in and rehash that. We have all these different things that just reiterate to us that God meticulously details these things long before they happen, because God is the master of history. He's the one who knows everything that's going to happen long before it takes place. And almost as warnings, not just to the Israelites, but to the Babylonians. They're warned to repent. And we've seen that in the case of Nebuchadnezzar, where God dealt with him time and time and time again. And his word continually comes to Nebuchadnezzar, trying to bring repentance, and ultimately did, at least at a short time. Yeah.
Just going back to Isaiah 13, where it talks about Babylon, would, in verse 20, it says, "It shall never be inhabited, and neither shall be dwelt in drink, neither shall it be dwelt in from generation to generation, and neither shall a radiant pitch pit there, neither shall a shepherd make a pool there." And it goes on and talks about the different strange creatures that would inhabit the city. The British Empire, at the height of the British Empire in the 17th, 1800s, especially 1800s, we had a lot of archaeologists that had written that would go to the Middle East, and we're doing a lot of excavations we're talking about now, and finds. They were amazed to find that the guides that they had from the Arabian people, this being the general population all throughout the Middle East, they would not spend the night in ancient Babylon. building a camp there. They thought it was a haunted place. They would go there in the daytime, but would not stay in the nighttime. They would leave. And so just looking at what the prophecy was right here, that's just an example of what the attitude was. 1,800 years, well, more than that, 2,000 years after Babylon was destroyed as a city. That to this day is an unoccupied place. One of the reports I heard here about 10 years ago, at the height of Saddam Hussein's reign, he had every intention of making Babylon his new capital. He was in a rebuilding process, trying to rebuild that city when he fell. And so it's just interesting to see how the judgment of God was so severe that it goes right down to the present day. It's been that way ever since.
Yeah, amazing stuff. Thanks. Okay, well, so we've seen the predictions. We see some of the fulfillments of that. Of course, we have the benefit of hindsight. We can look back and see, well, yeah, in fact, it did fall just like God had said. Many of these prophecies that may even seem a little bit obscure as you just read through it, well, they actually were fulfilled to a T, just like God said. In fact, it's one of the phenomenal areas of study that you can do in the Bible. As you look through the major prophets and some of the minor prophets as well, look at some of the fine detail that's given. The destruction of Tyre, as I mentioned earlier, the destruction of Babylon, the destruction of Assyria, and seeing how those details, just very specific prophecies in grave detail were fulfilled to the letter. It's just amazing. It's encouraging, it's inspiring for my faith to see God's word is absolutely true. He says it. Nobody would ever have predicted those kinds of things. Maybe some broad, oddball prophecies, but never anything so specific that you could see with absolute clarity that this was the hand of God that predicted these things. So, anyway, prophecies of the Bible were meticulously fulfilled. Well, the fall of the Babylonian Empire came suddenly. When the Medes and the Persians overran the city of Babylon in a night attack in 539 BC. Now, prior to that event, and that, by the way, that's what we read in Daniel chapter 5. Prior to that event, the Babylonian Empire had already fallen on evil days. Right? It rose to the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the renewed or resurrected one. It was brought to the height of its glory by Nebuchadnezzar's father. Obviously, under Nebuchadnezzar, it rose even higher. And then we've mentioned that the subsequent rulers were just a disaster. But here's a little bit of the history of the succession to the throne after Nebuchadnezzar. When he died in 562 BC, he was succeeded by his son, Marduk, Marduk. He was assassinated just 2 years after that. He wasn't super popular. In 560, Neriglissar took the throne. He died after just a few years of reign, and he was succeeded by his son, who was assassinated shortly after he came to the throne. And so you have, in a pretty concise period of time, about 4 different people that the throne passes through from hand to hand through assassinations and deaths. Now, Nabonidus came to power. That would be Nebuchadnezzar's son, or one of his sons, and he appointed Belshazzar as his co-ruler. And of course, Belshazzar is the one that held this ungodly feast in Daniel chapter 5, and he ultimately is recorded as perishing at the hands of the Medes and the Persians. Well, at the time of the downfall of the city of Babylon, that's recorded for us here, the city was still a monument to the genius of Nebuchadnezzar. All right, according to Herodotus, I'm going to give you some of his thoughts here in a little while. Herodotus was a Greek historian around the 5th century. But according to him, the city was about 14 miles square. Massive city, sprawling and expansive. The Euphrates River bisected it north and south. All right, there were 2 sets of inner walls. 2 sets of walls, I should say. There's inner walls and outer walls that protected the city. And according to the standards of its day, it really, the weaponry of its day, it rendered the city completely impervious to attack from without. All right? Herodotus said this: the walls were formidable, being 350 feet high. I mean, it's hard to believe. In fact, the tallest trees that we have out here are probably about 50 feet high. And we don't have massive trees like in some places around the country, but approximately 50 feet high. If you can just imagine a city wall that's about 7 times that high, it's impossible to scale. You can build a ladder or any kind of embankments that you could scale over that, and the walls were 87 feet thick. That's the outer walls, right? The walls were lined on the riverside, and so you have the river that bisects the city north and south, and inside the city, the river itself was lined with walls that kept anyone from being able to come in and penetrate into the city. There were 150 gates of solid brass that protected the entrances to Babylon. All right, on the walls were approximately 250 watchtowers surrounding the city that were 100 feet higher than the wall itself. I mean, you could see for miles and miles to view any kind of attack or any sort of tactics that the enemy might be preparing. The outside wall had a moat that was about 30 feet wide, a deep moat that was fairly unpassable. Well, during the height of its power, Babylon was provisioned for approximately a 20-year siege. That's what they had planned for. So they could self-sustain in that city for that long, just with the provisions that they had stored. The fact that there was a river, the Euphrates River no less, which is the largest river in that part of the world, mentioned all the way back into the book of Genesis as being one of the most mighty rivers in the world, that's running through the city, then you could essentially plan on it sustaining itself indefinitely with products that were grown there. And so that was probably not just intended for, but was a tremendous discouragement to anyone trying to attack it. I mean, why would you go and put your army there trying to besiege a city for 20 plus years? It would just be pointless. Within the walls, the city was laid out in square blocks with beautiful houses lining the street, fantastic marvels of architecture that were 3 to 4 stories high. The city included tremendous parks and gardens. Of course, we've talked about the phenomenal hanging gardens of Babylon that were built on terraces throughout the city near the capital area, near the palace. And those terraces supported large trees of every kind. There was a massive, expansive bridge, 660 feet long and 30 feet wide, that spanned the Euphrates River to enable access back and forth across that river in the city, connected the western and eastern halves of the city. There were tremendous buildings that were notable in Babylon. Obviously, the palace of the king, the temple of Bel, one of their chief gods, was over 8 stories in height tall. Many other buildings of lesser importance. But it was this city, proud of its invulnerability, that had ignored the rapidly expanding power of the Medes and the Persians, that was growing up as a synonymous kingdom in their days. Now, Media, as a separate kingdom, had matched the rise of the Babylonian Empire in its power and its magnificence. The Medes captured the city of Ashur in 614. By the way, Ashur is what was the namesake for Assyria. And so they had captured Ashur under alliance with the Chaldeans, with the Babylonians, and they had also captured Nineveh. Now, the downfall of the Assyrian Empire paved the way in that part of the world for the rise to prominence of Media, which was in alliance with Nebuchadnezzar during most of his reign. So they were not hostile towards one another, but they were allies in that sense. But the downfall of the Assyrian Empire was very significant in the rise to power. Now, Persia also rising to power under Cyrus II, and was conquered by the Persians around 549 BC. Media and Persia at that point were united in a common government, and they operated together as one nation. They still had 2 rulers that worked synonymously, and we'll see that in the text here even. That common united government between the Medes and the Persians lasted all the way until Alexander the Great in 331 BC. All right, their armies had proceeded to conquer much of the territory around Babylon up until the fateful night of 539 BC. And so, setting siege to the large city of Babylon, the Medes had dug a canal diverting the water that flowed under the city wall. And I'm quoting from some of Herodotus' history now. He's the one that identifies what had happened. We've seen from the Bible history, at the very time of Belshazzar's impious feast, the Medes and the Persians were entering the city on the dry channel underneath the mighty city walls. That's how they penetrated the city. The drinking feast that was celebrated by 1,000 lords apparently was shared by all the other inhabitants of the city. This was not just a localized event. So that the normal watch that kept the walls and the normal watch that maintained visual over the river entrances of the city wasn't even being observed. It allowed the invaders invaluable time in conquering a city before their presence was even fully understood. At the very time that the Medes were pouring into the city, the handwriting appeared on the wall that we talked about last week. Daniel correctly interpreted the writing as spelling the doom for the Babylonian Empire and the beginning of the empire of the Medes and the Persians. And that was what spelled doom for the fabulous empire of the Babylonians. It's really the symbol of Gentile glory and moral and religious wickedness. Well, here's what Herodotus says. All right, Cyrus. Now we see two different names here in Daniel chapter 5. You're going to see it talks about Darius the Mede, right, or Darius the Persian. Let me turn over there. Which one does it call him? Darius the Median. And then in the next chapter, in chapter 6 and verse 28, it talks about Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And so you have those two kings who are co-rulers. Now, sometimes the Medes would be in rule as the supreme ruler between those two empires, and sometimes the Persians would be, and it fluctuated back and forth, but they were in alliance and were a united kingdom in that sense. And so you have these two individuals that are on their way to Babylon, right? They've been taking up large chunks of territory in the surrounding area, and Cyrus, this is Herodotus' history, Cyrus was on his way to Babylon at a particular stream in the mountains, and it's one of the large watersheds that feeds into the Tigris River, and one of his royal horses, his favorite horses, was swept away in the river and drowned. Now, he was such an impulsive ruler, so furious, he basically said, I'm going to destroy this river. And so he set his entire army working on diverting it. And he said even women are going to be able to walk through without getting their thighs wet here in the future. And so they spent the entire summer campaign destroying that stream, destroying that river. And ultimately were able to do exactly what he intended. Well, by the time that was over, the entire summer campaign time was over, and so there was another full season before they were able to start their siege on Babylon. But that's the kind of the silliness, the craziness of some of these rulers. We saw that with Nebuchadnezzar too. Well, he gets to Babylon, and whether it was a stroke of genius on his part or whether it was a stroke of genius on one of his soldiers' part, somebody came up with the idea that, hey, here's the way to penetrate the city. We just did it somewhere else. There's no way that we can batter the walls. There's no way that we can get through these solid brass gates. The only vulnerable point into the city, which was meticulously watched by the Babylonians, was the river entrances. And the Euphrates River is such, there's no way that you could ever ford that river and bring an army in there. It just was not possible. And so well, they decided, well, we're going to divert this river. And so he masterfully planned with part of his army to stay there at the inlet to the river, and another large portion at the outlet on the opposite side, where they just waited without tipping their hand. And Darius marched away, or Cyrus rather, marched away with most of his non-warlike parts of his army, his laborers, and they went upstream and they began to work on a particular channel from which they could divert the river into a large swampy area. And they were able to accomplish that. He just told his soldiers, you guys be prepared and be ready. When the river drops and it's fordable, get in the city. Well, that just happened to coincide when he diverted the river and was able, and this is a work of tremendous amount of time and effort. It's not like it happened overnight when you understand how expansive the Euphrates River is. But when that happened for a short time, those guys were ready, and that just happened to coincide, with the night that Belshazzar, has his drunken celebration. That wasn't coincidence at all. God was overseeing that judgment. And so as the river level dropped, the soldiers marched in. The river, the embankments of the river and the walls along the river inside the city, it's not maybe the silly little Sunday school version that you might think of where they just came in and they walked into the city. I mean, it was designed for defense. Had even any of the Babylonian soldiers been sober, been at their post, been paying attention, they could have easily diverted any attack, even from these guys marching in this riverbed. They were still coming in thigh-deep water. Remember, that's what Isaiah had prophesied. I mentioned that earlier when we read, bear the thigh and ford the river, basically, is what God has said. He predicted long before that this is what was going to happen to destroy Babylon. And so they came in, the city completely unprotected. No one at their posts, no one watching. It would have taken one person, one soldier. Sound the alarm and let the city know and warn them. Everybody's drunk. Everybody is not at their posts. And he comes in and effortlessly destroys the Babylonian capital, takes the city, and the fall of Babylon was complete. And so, anyway, that's about all the time that we have this morning, but I wanted to give you a good understanding of the development, not just of the Babylonian Empire, but the Medes and the Persians as well, who are now going to come to power. And as we continue our study in the book of Daniel, we'll see Darius, and then we'll see Cyrus, and we'll see these individuals that are discussed. Not really any better rulers necessarily than the Babylonians had been. Equal, if not superior, in their cruelty and in their false religion. But God's judgment falls on Babylon, just as had been predicted. And God's justice was served, as it always is, against sin. So, all right, we'll go ahead and end with that. Thanks for your attention today. I hope it's been interesting and educational, and we'll push on in our study in the